Okay, so chances are you probably know the name Typhoid Mary. It's the name you give to a walking disease vector, a patient zero putting other people's lives at risk. But did you know that there was a real person behind that name, and she may not have known how much damage she was causing? Her name was Mary Mallon, but was she a villain or a victim? The Typhoid Mary story almost reads like an action movie. An invisible threat is winding its way through New York City, striking people down and getting worse by the day. Behind that threat, one cause. How do we catch them? And what do we do when we find them? We lock them up and throw away the key. Or even better, banish them to an island in the middle of the city. This is Batman villain stuff. And like all good Batman villains, this one has a tragic origin story. Mary Mallon's story starts out as the quintessential American immigrant narrative. When she was either 15 or 17 years old, sources differ, she sailed from Cookstown, Ireland, leaving behind her life of poverty and nearly everyone she knew, and arriving in New York in 1883. Her aunt and uncle had come over earlier, so she moved in with them. But life in America wouldn't be easy. As an Irish immigrant, she would have faced discrimination simply by virtue of her accent. But Mary Mallon had a stroke of luck. She managed to get a good job as a cook. Lucky break, right? Or the worst thing that could have happened. It was eventually discovered that Mary was infecting her employers and their families with typhoid, a disease spread through contact with feces by handling their food.
Mary's signature dish was vanilla ice cream with sliced peaches. It is the best friggin' dessert that I have had.
Mallon's reputation spread, and the more people she cooked for, the more typhoid germs she spread around. She wasn't doing it knowingly. Germ theory wasn't proven until the mid-1800s, and even surgeons continued to ignore the ramifications until the turn of the 20th century. The public knew even less about the role of germs in illness, let alone an uneducated immigrant like Mallon.
You could hemorrhage from the inside. People die from this.
Imagine being in her shoes. As far as you know, you've never had typhoid. Suddenly, a stranger shows up at your job and tells you you're spreading a disease you don't have, and you're killing people. Also, he wants a sample of your poop. You'd be well within your rights to chase that man out of the house with a knife, which is exactly what Mallon did. For the rest of her life, Mallon swore she wasn't carrying the disease and was being unfairly targeted. In 1909, she told a reporter that every time her stool was examined by the health department, she also sent a sample to an outside lab, which never found any typhoid bacilli. Key investigator Dr. George Soper found conclusive evidence connecting Mary to typhoid outbreaks in the homes where she was a cook. Despite that, she was never actually charged with a crime, let alone convicted of one. Turns out, accidentally making people sick because you don't wash your hands would be tough to prosecute. While more than a few people who crossed paths with her got sick and died, she wasn't legally responsible. We don't want to get too far in the weeds here, but the key to that is accidentally, as in there's no proof she purposely attempted to sicken people. Despite this, Mallon was held against her will for a total of 26 years. Her first confinement on North Brother Island, a New York facility used to quarantine people with infectious diseases, began in 1907. At this point, no healthy carriers had been yet discovered, so the scientists and judges involved convinced themselves she was being held so they could study her.
They called her, I love this phrase, she is a human culture tube. This pestilential entity that must be stopped.
But Mallon refused to be a lab rat for something she didn't understand. She objected to having samples of her blood and stool taken and reacted aggressively to any attempts to do so. The solution was to lock her up without telling her how long she'd be there, which is sort of unacceptable in what we call a free society. Mallon was given a small bungalow to live in and assisted the doctors and nurses on the island, but she had little else to do but sit and think about the fact that she was there against her will. While her name has gone down in history in connection with spreading disease, Mary wasn't a particularly unique medical case.
Though God's mercy, I've never caught it myself. Luck of the Irish, as they say.
What made her notable was Soper's discovery that she was the first person confirmed to be a healthy carrier of typhoid. The medical community had believed it was possible for years, but it wasn't proven until 1907, when Soper presented Mallon's case to the Biological Society of Washington, D.C. At the time, an estimated 6,000 to 9,000 new people became asymptomatic carriers in the U.S. each year, and the medical community knew it. Yet for some reason, Mallon was the only one ever incarcerated. Others might be required to register with the local health department and get periodic checkups, and obviously, they were encouraged to avoid handling other people's food. But they were allowed their freedom, probably because they didn't have an evil-sounding nickname like Typhoid Mary. In 1910, the hospital on North Brother Island got a new administrator who agreed to help Mallon get out. There was just one catch. Since she could still make people sick by handling their food, she had to promise never to work as a cook again.
I came from Ireland to escape the poorhouse, and that's where you'd be sending me?
Mallon was a proud woman and objected to taking the blame for something she didn't believe she'd done, telling the Topeka State Journal, "I had been told that all I had to do was promise to leave the state and live under another name, and I could have my freedom. But this I will not do. I will either be cleared or die where I am now." Clearly, it was too big an ask. For an Irish immigrant like her, cooking was the best job possible, dignified with decent pay. If she didn't work with food, she'd have to take a harder, lower-paying job, assuming she could find one without being outed as the infamous Typhoid Mary. Who would hire her knowing that? Mallon did work as a laundress for a short time, but 2 years after she gained her freedom, she disappeared. Then in 1915, it happened again, this time at a hospital.
We know how to not get typhoid, yet we all got it. What's happening? He says, wait a minute. Who's the cook here, baby? Who's the cook?
Mallon was once again the epicenter. While still not charged with a crime, the fact that she broke her non-legally binding promise got her sent back to involuntary quarantine until she died 23 years later. Mallon was enraged by her treatment at the hands of the health department and legal system. She'd been a law-abiding, gainfully employed member of the community, and then some scientists locked her up. Sure, she was technically killing people, but she wasn't the only one doing it. She wrote threatening letters to doctors who sent her to North Brother Island and filed suit against the health department for $50,000 in damages. The case went to the New York Supreme Court, but she lost. In her handwritten affidavit, there's visual proof of her emotional state. As she fills more pages, the handwriting morphs from perfect penmanship to a sloppy scrawl, and the tone of her writing becomes much angrier. Those who lived and worked with Mallon on the island knew better than to call her Typhoid Mary, and most were smart enough to avoid talking about the disease around her at all. Allegedly, she would get aggressive if anyone forgot and brought up the subject. Ultimately, Mallon did agree not to take a job as a cook in order to secure her release. But she added a few words to the document in her own hand, making it clear that she didn't accept responsibility for spreading typhoid. In 1915, Mallon was again confined to the hospital in North Brother Island. By this time, any danger she posed to the public had been considerably lessened, since even if she was released, she was no longer healthy enough to hold down a job as a cook. Some historians think Mallon may have had a minor stroke at some point that went unnoticed. There's at least one image of her with a slightly droopy mouth. What's certain is that she had a much larger stroke on Christmas Day 1932. She was found on the floor by a porter. The stroke had paralyzed her and she would never walk again. Despite her paralysis, which meant she couldn't work in a kitchen even if she wanted to, Mallon still wasn't released from confinement. She was simply moved from her private bungalow to the hospital building to be looked after. As the end of her life neared, she was never transferred to a hospital off the island or asked where she would like to be moved. Mary Mallon died in the hospital on North Brother Island on November 11, 1938, without ever regaining her freedom. By that point, she was resigned to the fact that she was going to die in forced isolation. She was said to have become more religious over the years as a way of coping with her situation. Throughout her life, she remained an intensely private person and shared very few personal details with others. To the end, Mallon insisted that she couldn't be making others sick because she was healthy.
I wasn't sick. People around me were dying like flies.
Those who had controlled her life were not done disrespecting her yet. There were conflicting reports on whether or not an autopsy was performed, and it may be that the original reports saying one was done were only to reassure the public. Officially, she died from pneumonia, and some sources say she was cremated. Mallon's remains were hurriedly buried on the same day she died. A funeral service at St. Luke's Catholic Church in the Bronx drew 9 anonymous mourners, although none of the healthcare workers who took care of her over the years bothered to attend. No mourners escorted her coffin to St. Raymond's Cemetery, where she was buried. Mary Mallon wasn't the only famous historical figure who was quarantined when it was discovered they were spreading disease, but she was treated particularly unjustly. Much of the blame for this lies at the feet of Dr. Soper, the man who would become her nemesis. Soper spent his career trying to keep her imprisoned. Meanwhile, he used her story to make himself famous. Over the years, Soper's tale became more and more dramatic and more unfair to Mallon. He refused to acknowledge her anger, insisting that if she'd just done what he'd asked, everything would have turned out okay. He described her as loud, opinionated, and obstinate, calling her overweight and manly, and even said that she was dirty. The fact that Mallon was unmarried was a huge strike against her at the time, and at one point, Soper embellished his story by adding a male friend for Mary, implying sexual uncleanliness as well. Unfortunately, no one ever asked Mallon for her side of things. All we have are legal documents outlining why she believes she should be free, and a few interviews that reporters, somewhat dubiously, claim to have conducted with her. The nickname Typhoid Mary first appeared in a 1908 edition of the Journal of the American Medical Association. By the following year, Typhoid Mary was writ large in newspaper headlines and remained so until she died, when the headlines announcing her passing again labeled her Typhoid Mary. Mallon was fully aware of her nickname and hated it with a passion. Eventually, the phrase became shorthand for anyone who spread disease. When a carrier was discovered regardless of what illness was actually present, they were referred to as another Typhoid Mary.
You know, I think he really likes Typhoid Mary.
There are plenty of facts about Typhoid Mary the average person doesn't know, but decades after her death, even professional historians have misrepresented Mallon's story. Despite her obvious and understandable misunderstanding about what being a healthy carrier meant, some historians have implied that Mallon knew she was making people sick and didn't care. But that's one thing we actually do know. Until the day she died, Mary Mallon was adamant that she was healthy, and as such, she couldn't possibly be spreading disease. And technically, she was. Asymptomatic means just that. Should she have stopped cooking? Well, yeah, but given the time and understanding of disease, her reaction is understandable.